Hi, I'm Skylar. I thought getting into college would finally make my family proud. Instead, they demanded I give it all up for my golden twin. They even tried to control my future with secret deals and hidden traps. How does a family love you so little they would rather lose you than let you shine? Before we dive in, have you ever felt invisible in your own family? What time are you listening to this and where are you watching from? Drop a comment. I'd love to hear your story. The dining room smelled faintly of lemon polish and strained patience. I sat at the long table, my fingers tracing the delicate grooves of the dark mahogany wood. The chandelier above threw tiny shards of light across the gleaming surface, but there was no warmth in the room, only cold, gleaming perfection. My parents were already seated side by side, their expressions carved into polite masks. Russell Reeves, my father, cleared his throat first, a habitual prelude to any unwelcome announcement. Denise, my mother, folded her hands neatly, her wedding band flashing under the light. Across from me, Alina twisted a napkin between her fingers, her lips pressed into a thin, practiced line. "We've been thinking, Skylar," my father said, voice calm, rehearsed. "Given the situation with Alina, it would be best for everyone if you reconsider your college plans." I blinked once, then again, not quite processing. Reconsider? I had earned my acceptance with late nights, sacrificed weekends, endless papers polished to perfection. I thought they would be proud. I thought wrong. For the sake of family harmony, my mother added smoothly, it would be the compassionate thing to do. They said it as if it were obvious, as if stepping aside was my duty, not even a favor, as if Alina's failure was somehow my shame to carry. I nodded stiffly, too stunned to argue. My fork lay abandoned on my plate. I heard the distant sound of the grandfather clock chiming, marking the slow death of my celebration. Later that night, sleep was a lost cause. I sat curled against my headboard, the acceptance letter clutched against my chest like a life vest in turbulent seas. Voices floated up the staircase, muffled but urgent. "You said you could guarantee her acceptance," my father hissed. There were too many applicants. "And we couldn't push harder without raising suspicion," my mother snapped back. The blood drained from my face. They had tried to buy Alina's way into college and failed. My success wasn't merely inconvenient. It was a betrayal of a plan they had been willing to cheat for. I pressed the letter closer, my heart hammering in my ears. The walls of my childhood home, once so familiar, now felt foreign, hostile. It wasn't just that they wanted me to sacrifice my future. It was that they had never believed I deserved it in the first place. The clink of cutlery against porcelain barely masked the tension hanging in the humid July air. I sat at the breakfast table, my toast untouched, while my parents exchanged glances thick with unspoken words. Alina pushed her food around her plate, eyes downcast, the center of the silent orbit. It was my father who spoke first, his voice measured, almost detached. "Skylar, your mother and I have been discussing some adjustments regarding college expenses." Adjustments. The word dropped like a stone into the shallow pond of my stomach. "We feel it's necessary," he continued, "to reallocate some resources. Alina's situation has proven more complicated than expected. She'll need extra support." I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. My grip tightened around my coffee cup. They weren't asking, they weren't suggesting, they were informing. "So," my mother chimed in too brightly, "we think it would be best to suspend financial coverage for your tuition, just temporarily, of course." My throat dried up. I nodded numbly, the fight draining from me before it even reached the surface. The idea of arguing felt futile in the face of such clinical betrayal. I retreated to my room under the guise of needing to process. What I needed was to breathe, to piece myself back together without anyone watching. I closed the door softly, leaning against it as if to physically keep the disappointment out. Memories swirled in my mind. Piano lessons I didn't want but practiced for hours because they thought it looked good on college applications. Awards handed off to Alina because we don't want her to feel left out. Every sacrifice, every quiet swallowing of my own desires leading to this moment. A soft knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Denise's voice, syrupy sweet, floated through the door. "Honey, can I come in?" I didn't answer, but she entered anyway, carrying a sleek, leather-bound folder. She sat beside me on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her carefully poised weight. "We want to support you," she said, laying the folder on my lap. "We just need to ensure everything stays manageable." I opened it with stiff fingers. Pages of dense legal language stared back at me. A financial agreement, conditions, clauses, a trap disguised as help. If I signed, I would surrender control over my tuition, my future, my autonomy. Every dollar would come with a string attached, pulled taut by the people who had just severed their trust. I stared at the pen she held out to me, my heart pounding so loudly I thought she must hear it too. And for the first time in a long time, I hesitated, not because I was scared of disappointing them, but because I was terrified of disappointing myself. The driveway was packed with cars when I arrived, their glossy bodies reflecting the sinking sun. The Reeves home stood proudly at the center of it all, festooned with banners, flowers, and strings of lights twinkling too brightly against the early evening haze. I inhaled the warm, sticky air, trying to summon the right smile before stepping inside. The house buzzed with the hum of congratulatory voices, all swirling around Alina. I watched her glow under the attention, her white dress making her look ethereal, untouchable. Laughter erupted as one uncle handed her a clumsily wrapped gift, while a cousin snapped photos for social media. Everywhere I turned, faces lit up for her. My name didn't make it into any of the speeches. Not when the school counselor spoke about Alina's perseverance. Not when my father raised his glass for a toast about family resilience and unity. I stood near the edge of the room, glass in hand, smiling so hard my cheeks ached, applauding when expected, invisible all the same. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't here for accolades, but part of me, some stubborn, childlike part, had still hoped for a nod, a glance, a shared memory of how we had both survived the endless hours of studying, the pressure. Instead, I drifted through the room like a ghost, my existence acknowledged only by the occasional nod from a distant relative who wasn't sure which twin I was. Later, I wandered upstairs under the pretense of finding some quiet. I pushed open the cracked door to the sitting room, meaning to catch a breath away from the crowd. That's when I heard it. "It's important," my mother's voice said, low but insistent. "We can't let Skylar outshine her. Tonight is Alina's moment." There was a pause, the clink of a wine glass. "You know how sensitive Alina is," she continued, her voice softening into that syrupy tone she reserved for manipulation. "Skylar should understand that stepping back is the right thing to do." The walls closed in tighter than the crowded party ever had. I closed the door without a sound, leaning back against it as my heart thudded dully against my ribs. I wasn't just forgotten, I was deliberately erased. Outside, the sky had deepened into a bruised purple, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and barbecue smoke. I slipped out the front door, unnoticed. Beneath the weight of the humid evening, I lifted my face to the sky, searching for any air that didn't smell like expectations and betrayal. I wasn't sure if I belonged anywhere anymore, but I was starting to understand where I didn't. The invitation came in the form of a neatly folded card, left on my nightstand like a peace offering. "Family dinner," it read, scrawled in my mother's cursive. "A fresh start, let's heal." The words sounded sweet, but they tasted bitter on my tongue. My fingers lingered on the thick cardstock, tracing the edges like it might reveal the truth hidden inside. A fresh start? After months of being pushed aside, stripped of every small piece of pride I had managed to carve out for myself? Still, a part of me hesitated. Maybe they finally understood. Maybe this was their way of saying sorry, without the awkwardness of words they weren't capable of speaking aloud. The air in the house grew heavier as the dinner approached. Every time I crossed paths with my parents, I caught the tight smiles, the overly casual comments about how nice it would be to have everyone together again. Even Alina seemed rehearsed, offering up small, strained compliments that didn't quite reach her eyes. The morning of the dinner, I sat at my desk, staring at the invitation one last time. My chest tightened with the familiar ache, the ache of wanting to be wanted, of craving a place at the table that had always seemed reserved for someone else, but somewhere, deep in the quiet spaces of myself, doubt was blooming. It whispered that peace with them always came with a price I couldn't afford anymore. When my mother called to confirm if I'd be attending, I let the silence stretch long enough to feel uncomfortable. "I don't think so," I said finally, voice steady, even though my heart hammered in my chest. There was a pause, sharp enough to cut through the line. I see, she said, voice clipped, polite, cold. Well, that's disappointing. The guilt gnawed at me long after I hung up. It clawed at my ribs, made me pace my room, made me almost call back and say I'd changed my mind. But I didn't. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin, Maggie. She was always a little more honest than the rest. Crazy that they invited the university guy to the dinner to talk you into switching schools, she wrote casually, as if this wasn't a landmine she was tossing into my lap. My stomach dropped. The dinner had never been about healing. It had been about manipulation. Another carefully orchestrated play to push me back into line. I stood by my bedroom window. The evening stretched out before me, painted in deep blues and purples. The humid air pressed against the glass. My reflection stared back at me, tired but alive in a way I hadn't been in years. For the first time, the anger wasn't just a quiet burn inside me. It was a spark, a promise. They had built a world where I was supposed to apologize for wanting more. I was done apologizing. The letter was waiting for me when I returned to my room. It sat there on my pillow, its edges slightly bent, the handwriting across the front soft and tentative, Alina's unmistakable scrawl. I picked it up carefully, as if it might crumble in my hands. Inside, the words spilled out with shaky vulnerability, pleading for another chance. She missed me. She needed me. Could I just defer my college start by 1 year? Just 1 year to figure things out together? My chest tightened. I sank down onto the bed, letting the letter droop between my fingers. In the silence of my room, memories rushed in unbidden. Lazy afternoons spent side by side with coloring books, whispering secrets under thick summer quilts. The nights I held her hand after bad dreams when no one else had noticed. Maybe it wasn't fair to leave her behind. Maybe I was cruel for even thinking about it. The guilt gnawed at me, burrowing deep, threading doubt through the fragile seams of my resolve. I folded the letter and placed it on my nightstand, trying to silence the echo of her words. Later that evening, restlessness drove me to the family computer. I told myself I was just looking at housing options again, browsing apartments I might not even be able to afford without parental support. The browser was slow, old tabs hanging open like forgotten doors. One click, then another. And there it was. A draft of Alina's letter, titled plainly, Letter to Skylar, Mom's Notes. I opened it before I could stop myself. The words stared back at me, familiar yet wrong. Lines I had just read in the letter upstairs, but here they were, annotated with instructions. Sound more emotional here. Remind her of shared memories. Stress loneliness without blaming her. A map, a script. Every tear-stained word had been engineered not from Alina's heart, but from Denise's careful calculations. I leaned back, the room tilting around me. The betrayal wasn't just Alina's passivity, it was systemic. It was crafted. Grief pressed hard against my ribs, a sharp, clean ache. I wasn't just losing my sister, I was losing the last illusion that any of them, had ever been real. Carefully, deliberately, I returned to my room. I picked up the letter again, feeling the weight of its false promises. Folding it along the creases, I slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk, locking it away with a quiet click. The lock wasn't just for the letter. It was for everything I had outgrown, but had been too loyal to leave behind. The laughter from the backyard drifted up through my window, thin and sharp against the heavy August air. I sat cross-legged on my bed, pretending to read, but the words blurred on the page. The heat had a way of pressing down, squeezing every thought into a slow, uncomfortable ache. From the open window, I caught snippets of conversation, the easy banter of Alina and her friends as they lounged around the patio, sipping sodas and lounging on cheap folding chairs. "You know Skylar will give in," Alina's voice floated up, bright and careless. "She always does. That's what good sisters are for, right? Sacrifice." A chorus of laughter followed, light and dismissive, as if my life, my dreams, were just a footnote in their amusement. I sat frozen, the book slipping from my hands onto the floor with a dull thud. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd heard wrong. Maybe the heat had twisted the words, but deep down, I knew better. The anger rose slowly, a tide that pulled at everything I had been trying so hard to keep steady. Memories sharpened into painful clarity. All the times I had stepped aside, quieted myself, dimmed my own light so Alina could shine. Not because she asked me to, because I had been taught that was love. Later that evening, I met up with Kayla, the only friend I had kept close through all the turbulence. We sat at the coffee shop downtown, the ceiling fans spinning lazily above us, trying and failing to beat the sticky air. I told her everything, the words tumbling out faster than I could catch them. Kayla listened quietly, her fingers curling around her cup. "You know," she said finally, "Alina's been saying that for years. I always thought you knew." I blinked at her. She used to joke how you would fix things, that no matter how much she screwed up, you'd clean it up. You were the golden ticket she never had to work for. The room tilted. It wasn't just today. It wasn't just the party or the letter. It had always been this way. I left the coffee shop in a daze, the sounds of traffic and cicadas blurring together into a single low hum in my ears. Back at home, I avoided everyone, slipping up to my room without a word. Standing in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the girl staring back at me. The girl who had spent so long trying to be good, to be small, to be manageable. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. No more. No more folding myself into the spaces left over. No more sacrifices made in the shadows of someone else's comfort. This was the last time I would ever bend to fit a life that was never meant for me. The knock on my door came just before sunset, soft but deliberate. I set my book down, feeling the familiar tension coil in my stomach. When I opened the door, there they stood, my parents, side by side, almost solemn in their presentation. "We have something for you," my mother said, her smile too wide, too practiced. My father handed over a small, neatly wrapped box. The weight of it in my hands felt heavier than it should have. I peeled back the wrapping slowly, revealing a velvet jewelry box nestled inside. Inside was a silver bracelet, delicate and gleaming under the dying light. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note. "The choice is yours." I stared at it, at them, at the space between us that had grown so vast it seemed impossible to bridge now. Their faces were expectant, a little too eager. I managed a nod, murmured something resembling gratitude, and closed the door quietly behind me. Sitting on the edge of my bed, the bracelet balanced on my palm, I tried to untangle the mess of feelings knotting inside me. It was beautiful, yes, it should have meant something, but I could feel the strings, invisible yet unmistakable, pulling taut beneath its polished surface. Later that night, sleep a distant memory, I turned the bracelet over in my fingers. The cool metal against my skin only deepened my unease. Almost without thinking, I fetched a small screwdriver from my desk drawer and began inspecting the clasp more closely. It didn't take long to find it. A tiny, almost imperceptible chip nestled inside the latch. A tracker. The room spun around me. The gift had never been about trust. It had never been about choice. It was surveillance, plain and simple. A leash disguised as love. The betrayal burned hotter than anything that had come before. I pressed the bracelet flat against the desk with shaking hands, the small metallic click of it hitting the wood far too loud in the silent room. I thought about every second I had doubted myself, every moment I had softened because I wanted to believe they still saw me as something more than a pawn in their desperate game. I thought about the little girl who once waited by the window for them to come home, who believed every broken promise could be fixed if she just tried harder. I wasn't that girl anymore. I placed the bracelet carefully in the center of my desk, the silver catching the lamplight like a cold, dead thing. It wasn't just jewelry. It was the tombstone of every piece of trust they had ever asked me to carry. The restaurant buzzed with low, polite conversation and the clinking of silverware against china. Candlelight flickered across the polished surfaces, casting everything in a soft golden glow that felt painfully false. My family was already seated when I arrived. My father stood first, pulling out my chair with an exaggerated smile, while my mother gestured to the empty plate in front of me like it was an invitation to reconciliation. Alina wore a pale blue dress, her hair curled just so, her face bright with the kind of hope that made my stomach turn. It was all theater, the smiles, the warmth, the carefully choreographed show of unity. I sat down, folding my hands neatly in my lap, feeling every set of eyes at the table weigh heavy against my skin. They talked about the weather, about college plans that didn't include me, about family vacations and holiday traditions, each word chipping away at the fragile shell I had built around myself. Under the table, my fingers brushed against the bracelet at my wrist. Cool metal. A cold reminder of everything that had been asked of me, and everything I had finally refused to give. As the waiter cleared the last of the dishes, my mother leaned in slightly, her voice soft, coaxing. "Skylar, we know you've been under a lot of pressure. All of this, we can work through it. As a family." I looked around the table, at my father's expectant nod, at Alina's bright, brittle smile, at the empty, glimmering plates, and I knew this was my moment. Without a word, I reached for the bracelet. Slowly, deliberately, I unfastened it. The clasp gave way with a soft, final click. I placed the bracelet in the center of the table. "I'm choosing myself," I said quietly, the words so calm they didn't sound like mine. For once. Silence swept over the table like a winter storm. My mother's hand froze halfway to her wineglass. My father's smile faltered. Alina's eyes widened, confusion flickering across her face before slipping into something like hurt. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress with a steady hand. No one moved to stop me. No one said my name. Outside, the night air was thick and heavy, but it tasted sweeter than anything I had breathed in months. I walked slowly toward the parking lot, my heart hammering, but my steps sure. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Removed from family group, just like that. Gone, like a smudge wiped from a window. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, watching the notification fade into the darkness of the night. The final chain had fallen away. The mornings were cooler now, the sharp edge of summer giving way to the crisp bite of late fall. My little apartment carried a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence of unspoken resentments, but a peaceful hum that filled the spaces between heartbeats. I learned the rhythms of my new life slowly. The whir of the coffee maker at dawn, the creak of the wooden floors under my bare feet, the way sunlight pooled lazily across the worn armchair by the window. Small things maybe, but each one a tiny declaration. I was still here. I was still standing. Sometimes when the air grew still and my mind wandered, I thought of them. Of my parents' tight smiles, of Alina's wounded glances, of the house that had once tried to make me small enough to fit inside its perfect frame. The memories didn't sting as sharply anymore, but they hadn't dulled completely either. They sat quietly in the corners of my mind, not haunting, just existing. Loss was a strange thing. It didn't howl or tear at me like I had feared. It was quieter, heavier, settling in the bones like an ache you learn to live with. I realized that freedom hadn't been about proving them wrong. It hadn't even been about leaving them behind. It was about leaving behind the version of me that needed their approval to feel whole. At the community college, I registered for classes without anyone peering over my shoulder or critiquing my choices. Literature, psychology, a creative writing workshop that made my hands itch to put stories on paper again. I met people who didn't know my history, who laughed with me not out of obligation, but because they genuinely liked my company. I started building something new. Quietly, steadily. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon in streaks of gold and rose, I sat by my window, a blank piece of stationery on the desk beside me, a letter to my future self. I hadn't written a word yet. What could I say to her, to the woman I hoped to become? I didn't have all the answers, but maybe, I thought, as the first stars blinked awake in the darkening sky, being enough had never been about them seeing me clearly. Maybe it was about me finally seeing myself. Walking away from the people who raised you isn't easy. It doesn't happen in a single night or with a single decision. It's 1,000 small heartbreaks that build into a choice to honor yourself when no one else will. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't have to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. You don't have to trade your dreams for their approval. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself, even if it means standing alone for a while. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from something or someone to find who you really are? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If this video touched you, leave a 1 or tell me where you're watching from. And if you didn't connect with it, let me know why. Every voice matters here. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more stories that speak to the heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. New stories are coming soon, and I can't wait to share them with you.